Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. I am your host, Professor Alon Burstein. Thank you to those who have already joined. And we are here to discuss everything that has happened in the last several weeks in the arena of the Israel-Hamas War, the Israel-Palestine arena, and everything else that is going on in the Middle East. First things first, I'm going to say happy 2026 to anyone who I have not corresponded with since the new year. I'm also going to say a few words about myself and some of the news that's coming out of my channel. So, I am Alon Burstein. I am a professor of political science and an Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'm also going to put into the chat now, and I will also add into the comments later, 2 links. One of them is to my newsletter. If you're interested to sign up to hear about the different live events and to look at some of the other news that I put out about the Israel-Palestine arena, feel free to sign up to that. A second link that I'm putting in is to a course. I have now developed a new online course. This comes in response to several people that have asked when I'm going to start teaching a little bit online beyond the university about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I have developed a new online course. It is called Unpacking the Israel-Palestine Conflict. It is going to be 4 sessions. We are going to look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, essentially how we got to October 7th and the Israel-Hamas War. We're going to go back a little over 100 years. We're going to talk about what happened in the beginning of the conflict and the dynamics between the parties, Zionism, Palestinian identity, look at Israel-Arab wars, look at how the entire conflict morphed from an Israeli-Arab conflict to an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Oslo Accords, Gaza Strip, and eventually how we got to the war right now. So with that intro speech, I am now copying into the chat these 2 links that I just said. Like I said, one is to the newsletter and the other is a link to sign up for my course. The link to the course is going to take you to a page where I'm offering a discount to those who sign up in the coming days. So feel free to sign up. I've limited the amount of people that can join the course because it is the first time I'm running it. So I want to get some feedback, but happy to see any of my regular subscribers. So that link is now there. Other than that, I am going to now say what we're going to review in this live session. I'm also welcoming everyone who is now joining. And again, feel free, as always, say where you're from. Feel free to send in any questions. I do recommend that you preface your questions with the word question or Q so that I can actually make sure that it's highlighted in the chat. And that is that. So what I'm going to be talking about on this live, I'm going to do like this probably a little bit shorter than some of my lives in the past, although I'll stick around if there are more questions. Really what I want to cover is 2 main things. One, what has happened in the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, because there was a lot of hype leading up to that meeting. That meeting happened at the end of 2025. Everyone was looking forward to, okay, now they're going to decide what's going to be the future of the Gaza Strip, what's going to happen with Iran, what's going to happen with the deal with Hezbollah and Lebanon. So what did they decide? What did they decide? Where do things stand? And what's happening with phase 2? Phase 2 is supposed to start now at the beginning of 2026. So where are we? And where do things stand? So I'm going to focus a lot about that. I'm then also going to talk at length, to some extent, about what is happening with Hamas. A lot of interesting things happened with the Hamas movement over the last 2 weeks. Chief among them are that the movement announced that they are going to hold elections for the movement's leadership. This is something that has not happened in recent years. There was supposed to be an election for the leadership in 2024. It got postponed as a result of the war and the fact that the leaders kept on either being assassinated or killed. And now they've announced there's going to be elections. The outcome of these elections, the 2 favored candidates, one of them is Halil Haya, the other is Khalid Mashal, the 2 favored candidates vastly disagree about what should be the trajectory of the Hamas movement, what should be the future of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And the results of that election leadership is very likely going to be very, very instrumental when it comes to understanding the trajectory of the war. So while the news about Hamas's elections, I will say, at least from my end, I have not seen it covered with as much enthusiasm or as much interest as it should, I'm going to make a pitch for the fact that it is extremely important, these elections. I'm going to upload a separate video in the coming week, hopefully, about the Hamas leadership structure, how these elections happen, who's involved, etc. But for now, I'm just going to more explain why I'm saying this is extremely important at this stage. So we're going to talk about Trump and Netanyahu. We're going to talk about phase 2, Hamas leadership, and then I'm not going to get away without talking a little bit about the West Bank and Lebanon and things like that, but that's going to be my main focus. So with that, I'm taking a pause to hydrate. If there are any questions or people would like me to focus on anything else, feel free to send that into the chat. If you've just joined now, I'm again going to say that there are 2 links that I'm going to every now and then throw into the chat again. One is to sign up to my newsletter, and the other is to register for a course that I'm now going to be teaching in February about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So with that, pausing for a drink of water. If there are any questions already, feel free to shoot them into the chat. Otherwise, feel free to just say hi. Let me know where you're from or how your year has been so far, the last 4 days. Hi, Jeff from Arizona. It's a weather like in Arizona right now. Probably a little bit nicer than here in the northeast area. Giving it another 5 seconds. Question: discussing original Hamas elections or something more recent? What I'm going to be discussing, thanks for asking for the clarification, what I'm going to be discussing is a current elections. Hamas has announced that they're going to hold elections for the leadership role of Hamas right now. The leader of Hamas was Ismail Haniyeh. He was assassinated in July of 2024. Then after that, the leadership was transferred essentially to Yahya Sinwar in the Gaza Strip. He was killed, not assassinated, because he was killed actually randomly by the Israeli military in Rafah in October 2024. Since then, the leadership is split between a council of 5 people. Now we're going to be talking about they're holding elections and there's going to be a new leader appointed, why that's so important. Other question coming in: how does Hamas still have ammo left? I'm going to talk about that. It's a great question about Hamas's military structure. Where is it coming from? Is it all big stockpile? Excellent question. If I do not answer it by the end of what I'm going to say about Hamas and Gaza, please ask that again and also scold me for not answering that because it should come up. So giving it another 5 seconds now. Any other questions? Hi from Israel. Pretty late in Israel. Thank you for joining. I'm the most comprehensive and always learn something I don't hear locally. Thank you so much. I'm very honored, and thank you for staying up and joining at this hour. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about, like I said, we're going to start from looking at the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu. So there was a lot of speculation about what this meeting was supposed to be about. It didn't actually make sense to a lot of people that there was going to be a meeting now, and there was a lot of, I'll say, hype in Israel about the fact that the meeting was actually just an excuse for Netanyahu to come to the United States for New Year's. I'm not getting into that, whether it's true or it's not. The fact is that there was a meeting between the sides, and there was a lot of hype about what they should be discussing. What was expected is that they're going to focus on phase 2 in the Gaza Strip. Phase 2, again, it's supposed to include everything. It's supposed to essentially include the disarming of Hamas, Hamas demilitarizing, and the Gaza Strip entirely demilitarizing, Hamas no longer being in governing power, the Israeli military withdrawing from Gaza, the establishment of the Board of Peace, the National Stabilization Force rebuilding Gaza. All that is phase 2. In practice, the first steps of phase 2 are going to be the establishment of the Board of Peace. That is supposed to be this international governing body that is supposed to take some sort of governing responsibility of the Gaza Strip. The establishment of the ISF, International Stabilization Force, and the beginning of a rebuilding process in Gaza. No one is seriously talking about Hamas disarming anymore or about taking over the territory that Hamas governs. I'll talk about that again a little bit later, but it was expected that Trump and Netanyahu would at least discuss those things, would at least discuss the establishment of the Board of Peace, the ISF, how these things are going to be implemented. I will say it is possible that they discussed them. However, there has been no statements after that meeting, and there's been a lot of speculation. Did they agree on anything? do we actually know what's going to happen moving forward? So I'm going to review a little bit from what were the statements that they did make answering reporters' questions, and from that piece together what might have been discussed. The most important thing for Israel coming into this meeting was to attempt to condition moving on to phase 2, moving on to the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip, condition that on Hamas disarming. In Israel, there's a lot of fear that Trump just wants to move forward. Trump wants to keep on saying there's peace in the Middle East. He's repeating this constantly. There's peace, first time in 3,000 years. That's a number he keeps on throwing out there. And he just wants to see movement forward. And Israel has a lot of concern that he's essentially going to enforce moving forward on phase 2 without Hamas disarming. So Israel wanted to say Hamas first has to disarm and to return the body of the last hostage that is still held in the Gaza Strip, and only then can we move on to phase 2. In terms of what Israel actually achieved at that meeting, there's conflicting reports. In Israel, it was reported time and again that indeed Trump agreed that Hamas has to be disarmed in order for phase 2 to happen. I will say that when it came to answering reporters' questions, Trump was more vague about that. The quote that I have listed here is Trump was asked quite explicitly, will the rebuilding of Gaza begin before Hamas disarms? And his response was simply, I think it will begin pretty soon, yeah. That's a quote. That tells us several things. That tells us that, first of all, Trump is not, at least publicly, conditioning the rebuilding of Gaza and the beginning of implementing phase 2 on Hamas disarming. And what that means is that very likely the United States is planning to move forward with what they have mentioned before, Project Sunrise, this idea of rebuilding the Gaza Strip, but doing it specifically in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. The Israeli military right now controls, it depends who you believe, between 55% and 58% of the Gaza Strip. The rest of the territory is governed de facto by Hamas. And while the entire Trump plan said that phase 2 would include the entire Gaza Strip because Hamas was going to be disarmed and ousted from power, and therefore all of Gaza would be rebuilt, what has become the de facto plan is actually rebuilding areas within the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. And then the plan, according to the architects of the plan in the United States, is that Palestinians will hopefully be enticed to come into those areas that have been rebuilt, and therefore Hamas will lose its grip on the population. And again, in the initial plan, the United States says, therefore, hopefully, Hamas will begin to disintegrate. The fact that Trump is saying, yes, Hamas does need to be disarmed, but also saying, but phase 2 is going to commence very, very soon, the rebuilding at least, is an indication, at least to me, that the United States is planning to move forward and not conditioning the rebuilding of Gaza or beginning these plans on Hamas actually disarming. In addition to that, Trump also said that Hamas does need to disarm, and he added also something that was interesting. He said, and it will be very bad for them if they don't, and Israel is capable of doing so and no one would blame them. But then he added, but there's also a lot of other countries that are willing to do so. First thing I'll say is, at least publicly, that's not true. There is no country that has been willing to engage in the actual fighting and disarming Hamas. All countries that have agreed to participate in the ISF have openly said that they will do so, so long as they do not have to fight Hamas. But at the same time, that is also an indication. If Trump is saying Hamas has to disarm, but even if they don't, there are other countries that will do that, is yet another indication that he is not leaning towards letting Israel do that. When it came to talking about Iran, when it came to talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, Trump had no problem in saying, if need be, Israel will go in and attack. If need be, Israel will go in and invade. If need be, Israel will pound them again. When it came to Hamas, he said Israel could do that, but there's other countries that are willing to do that. Once again, there was no official statements. But reading between the lines, what I see there is that Trump is very, very dead set on the fact that Israel's not going to return to fighting Hamas, at least at this stage, and wants to see a movement towards phase 2. In addition to that, other things that came up in their meeting, there was a lot of talk about Turkey. Israel really wants to try to keep Turkey out of the Gaza Strip. Turkey really wants to be the one that sends troops to Gaza. Israel and Turkey are on a collision path already in Syria, and in other places. And therefore, Israel is very weary about Turkey coming into the Gaza Strip. In turn, Trump is quite eager to continue to solidify his relationship with Turkey and with the Turkish leader Erdogan. And with regards to that, also, there were some interesting statements that were made. Trump did say that maybe Turkey would participate in the ISF, maybe they won't, and said that to some extent is also up to Netanyahu. At the same time, he also said that Erdogan is a very good friend of his. He also said that Erdogan deserves a lot of credit for what has happened in Syria and the ousting of Assad. And he also said, in response to questions about selling F-35 planes to Turkey, that Israel will have no problem with that and that Israel's actually in favor of that. In brackets, I'm going to say Israel's very much against that, and Israel has been trying to pressure the United States to not carry out that deal. So the fact that, again, Trump is publicly saying, with Netanyahu standing next to him, Israel's going to be just fine with Turkey no matter what, is yet another indication that while Israel is saying Turkish forces are not going to be part of the ISF, the United States, at least to some extent, wants that to happen. Whether they'll force Israel to do that or not, that I'm not sure. Three more things that happened with regards to the meeting, and again, with the speculation about what was said in that meeting. And then I'll talk about, in practice, what do we know? Other things that were said in question period were, with regards to Iran, the two leaders said very openly that if need be, there will be another round of fighting with Iran. There's been a lot of reports about Iran rebuilding its ballistic missile capabilities, although Iran is right now facing its own internal challenges when it comes to massive protests that are happening throughout the country. If I have time, maybe I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. That's in terms of Iran. In terms of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Trump said quite blatantly, was where he was actually most blatant about what might happen. He said that if the Lebanese military fails to disarm Hezbollah, Israel will go in and finish the job. So there, unlike Gaza, Trump is very, very open. A third thing that was said, which was very interesting, was regarding the West Bank. This was the only place that, despite Trump heaping massive praise on Netanyahu throughout the entire meeting, this was the only place where Trump openly said, on the West Bank, we do not agree 100%. The next day, Axios reported that Trump had asked Netanyahu to stop what is happening in the West Bank, to stop the massive buildup of settlements that has been happening over the last month. Over the last several months, there's been a wave of new settlements being approved in the West Bank, and specifically over the last month. Different reports are between 19 and 37 settlements are in the process of being approved. There's also been a massive uptick of settler violence against Palestinians, alongside Palestinian violence against settlers and Israeli military, but the increase is on the settler violence side. And as a result, Trump said, according to that report in Axios, that Israel has to get control over what is happening in the West Bank because, according to Trump, this is one of the things that is stopping a lot of Arab countries from wanting to participate in the ISF. They don't want to be part of placating Gaza while Israel is, quote unquote, running wild as far as they're concerned in the West Bank. And also because this is one of the things that's stopping the EU from taking part in a lot of what's happening in the rebuilding of Gaza. So that was the one place that there was an explicit collision between Trump and Netanyahu, at least openly, was with regards to what is happening in the West Bank. Now, with that, on the practical level, what do we know that actually happened in that meeting that may have impact moving on? First, the next day, while Netanyahu was still in the United States, the Pentagon approved the sale of 25 new F-15s to Israel. That's important on a regional scale. F-15s are the type of planes that Israel used primarily in its attacks against Iran and also in the attack against Qatar, because while they're an older model, they could carry certain types of warheads. So that unto itself may be a product of this deal, but it is one of the things that may have impacts on moving forward. A second major thing, though, and this is going to relate to what is happening in the Gaza Strip. A second major thing relates to the Rafah crossing. Reminder, the Rafah crossing is this crossing over here. It is a crossing between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Israel took control of that crossing already in the middle of 2024. And according to Trump's deal, in the first phase, already in October of 2025, the Rafah crossing was supposed to be open to both directions, for Palestinians to be allowed to exit the Gaza Strip and to re-enter the Gaza Strip. Israel never lived up to that side of the deal. Israel said because Hamas never returned all the bodies of hostages, it was going to keep the Rafah crossing closed. Since then, Israel said that it wanted to open the Rafah crossing, but only for the exit of Palestinians, which Egypt and the United States and lots of countries disagreed to. And since then, it's been a stalemate and the Rafah crossing has been closed. Several days before the Trump-Netanyahu meeting, there were some reports that the United States agreed without Israel, bypassed Israel and agreed with the negotiating countries that it was going to force Israel to open the Rafah crossing. Then, during this meeting, the Rafah crossing came up, and wouldn't you know, 2 days after this meeting, Israel announced that the Rafah crossing is going to be open to both directions, for Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip and to re-enter the Gaza Strip. Now, I will say, first of all, that hasn't happened yet. They said it was going to happen several days ago. It hasn't happened yet. So take that with a grain of salt, because Israel several times already has said it's going to open, and each time there's been a problem, sometimes with Egypt, sometimes with the Palestinian Authority, who's going to take control of it, but de facto it hasn't happened. Point number one. Point number two, though, if it does happen, it is going to be a major step forward with regards to the mobility of Palestinians, especially injured Palestinians, the ones that are in need of medical attention, to leave the Gaza Strip. But it's also going to be something that's going to add, I will say, somewhat of a security and bureaucratic nightmare to the situation in Gaza. Because, again, if we look at the map, and I realize that it may not be as easy to see, but hopefully you can see what I'm pointing at, the entire area of Rafah over here, Rafah and Han Yunis, are under Israeli military control, which means that for Palestinians to get to the Rafah crossing, they have to leave the area that is controlled by Hamas over here, cross into IDF-controlled area, and then get to the crossing, and then come back. There is no reports about how that's going to happen. Is the Israeli military going to have a veto over who goes and who doesn't? Can Hamas operatives, if they're unarmed, go through the Israeli military-controlled area? We don't know. So a lot of talk about the Rafah crossing just being opened. I will say there's still a lot to negotiate about how that happens and what will be the actual mechanisms that will allow it to open. Third, and this is possibly the biggest thing with regards to the actual concrete outcomes of the meeting between the sides, several days after the meeting, in fact, I think this just happened today, it was reported in several sources, Israeli and Palestinian, that in fact, in that meeting, Israel came under monumental pressure from the United States to actually move forward, even symbolically, with a rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. And as a result, there is already operational plans to begin building that model city the United States wants to build in the areas of Rafah. Rafah has been almost entirely razed to the ground. And over the last several months, there's been a lot of engineering units of the Israeli military that have been already clearing a lot of the rubble in order to flatten the area for this new model city the United States wants to build as part of its plan to rebuild Gaza in the areas that are controlled by the Israeli military. According to the reports that came out earlier today, Israel is now going to expedite those operations in order to actually move forward with the rebuilding of Rafah into some sort of model city in the coming weeks. Whether that's true or not true, I am not sure. What can we take from this meeting? And then I'm going to pause and look at some of the questions that I see have come into the chat. What can we take away from this meeting? First of all, if I didn't emphasize it enough, I'll emphasize it now. During this meeting, Trump heaped monumental praise onto Netanyahu. This is something that has been described by a lot of international news outlets as though Netanyahu's campaign manager wrote Trump's speeches. Trump was talking about Netanyahu as the savior of Israel. Israel will not exist if not for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the wartime leader, but he's being persecuted by the courts. Netanyahu should be pardoned despite the charges that he's under, etc., etc. And there was a lot of speculation about what's behind this, because Trump has no problem heaping praise on leaders. He also has no problem not heaping praise on leaders. And most of the speculation that I've seen, and I would tend to agree with, is distinguishing between what happened in public and what happened in private. And the fact that in public, Trump was heaping so much love and praise on Netanyahu, a lot of commentators that usually are pretty accurate have suggested This is likely because in private, Trump was twisting Netanyahu's arm and saying, fact, you're going to open the Rafah crossing, and the Palestinian Authority is going to be the one in control of it. Fact, you're going to start the rebuilding of Gaza, and Israel is also going to pay for the clearing of the areas in Rafah, and it's going to be before Hamas disarms. Fact, Turkey may in fact be part of the ISF. Then, heaping a lot of praise on Netanyahu in public is the carrot that came alongside that stick. That's speculation. That's speculation. But again, all the things that we do know is that the Rafah crossing is going to be open, even though Israel didn't want it to be open. That Israel has instructed engineering units to expedite the clearing in Rafah for the rebuilding purposes, even though Israel does not want to rebuild yet. And when it came to Turkey, that Trump mostly said Erdogan's a great friend and Israel's going to be very happy with Turkish involvement. So I'd say that there's some merit to that speculation that all the praise that Trump heaped on Netanyahu is because in private, actually, this meeting mostly produced pressure on Israel. I'm going to pause here for one moment and look at some of the questions. A lot of people have joined recently, so I'm going to say, for those of you who have joined, welcome. If it's your first time joining my channel, please do hit that subscribe button. We talk a lot about everything that's happening in the Israel-Palestine arena. I'm also going to put into the chat 2 links, one to my newsletter, one to an online course that I'm currently developing. Feel free to check it out. So I'm putting that into the chat right now, and then I'm going to look at some of the questions that have come in, and feel free to write any more questions that you might have. So I am scrolling up right now. In Tasmania, it's a day of summer. You make us jealous, Swally. Question, how does the IRGC possibly falling affect Hamas and other proxies? So there's a lot of protests and riots that are happening in Iran at this point, and a lot of people are speculating this may be the end of the regime. I wouldn't go that far yet, although there was a report in the New York Times today quoting several top-level officials in Iran saying that the regime is fighting for its life. I will say, even if the Iranian regime were to be overthrown, first of all, that doesn't happen overnight, and the IRGC is still very powerful, and its proxies are very powerful. 1. 2, unlike Hezbollah, and unlike even the Houthis, Hamas is actually not that affiliated with Iran as has been painted. They're obviously very supported by Iran. They have received a lot of funding from Iran, received a lot more funding from Qatar, but they have received a lot of funding from Iran. But Hezbollah is an Iranian arm. If Iran falls, Hezbollah is clinging for its life. The Houthis are dependent on Iran for a lot of things. They're not an Iranian arm, but they're dependent on Iran for a lot of things. Hamas enjoys the support. The IRGC falls. Hamas is not as effective as I would say some people might speculate. That's my analysis, at least. Other comments. This man crush of Trump on Erdogan is a real problem. I like the characterization. One of the things that I've said about Trump, a lot of people say that he is inconsistent. True. I say he's unpredictable. I also say he's extremely emotional. And he does develop a lot of affections for leaders. He develops a lot of hatred for other leaders. Very often this has to do with his personality. A lot has to do with diplomacy. But yes, I think that's a good characterization. Question, if Israel rebuilt parts of Gaza they control, who would govern that area? Jeff, that is an excellent question. That is the main question. That's the question I'm going to talk about in a moment when we come to look at phase 2. So who actually governs that area? What is it going to look like? Excellent question. Not answering it right now because I promise you that is where we're going. Shows that you're listening. Anything else? Any other questions? It's nice to see some of the familiar faces in the chat. Anyone have anything else? Just to give me a moment to have a drink. Okay, let me know in the chat also. Some people have said that when I turn around, you can't hear my microphone as well. So those of you who have been listening, please let me know if that is true or not, while I'm going to slowly move on to talking about, so what is happening actually on the ground when it comes to the implementation of phase 1, phase 2, and where do things stand. So where do things stand in the Gaza Strip? And here, I'm not actually talking about the day-to-day life in Gaza. I'll say a couple words about that later, but I'm going to focus less about that today. I've spoken about that in most of my different lives. Today, I'm focusing a little bit more on the overarching political side. What is happening with regards to the implementation of Phase 1 and Phase 2? Phase 1 got stalled when it came to the return of all the bodies of hostages, and then the humanitarian aid that Israel wanted to limit, but the United States took it over, and then, as I said, the Rafah crossing. There is currently one last body that remains in the Gaza Strip of a hostage belonging to Ron Gueli. Israel has said until Hamas returns that body, it is not willing to consider Phase 1 done, and therefore it's not willing to move on to Phase 2. Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have said they cannot locate that body, and that has been where things have been stalled. A couple of things that happened over the last 2 weeks. On December 22nd, Israel reportedly gave the negotiating countries a list of names of operatives of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whom they said these are people who know where Gueli's body is, according to Israeli intelligence. These are people who held Gueli's body. Some reports, there's actually a report from a Palestinian source, suggested that Israel also had deliberately not attacked these operatives because they know the location of Ron Gueli's body. According to Israeli sources, the Hamas movement did nothing with that list. Then, 6 days later, on December 28th, there was an uncharacteristic event that was reported. This began from being reported by local news sites in Gaza, and then started to be reported also elsewhere, which is that Israel went into Gaza City, into Palestine Square. That is an area in the northern parts of Gaza City over here, about a kilometer, half a mile beyond the yellow line where Israel controls, and arrested an operative of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That Israel said that operative knows the location of Ron Gueli's body. That is unique because since the ceasefire, Israel has rarely carried out such operations of invading ground forces beyond the yellow lines, but a lot of shootings and activity and airstrikes happening along the yellow line, but ground forces going in and arresting a specific operative. Reportedly, this happened without any gun battles or anything like that. Since that report, there was a report in Al-Sharq al-Awsat, this is a news outlet out of Saudi Arabia, that quoted both sources in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and in Hamas with regards to the body. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad sources said they do not know where Ron Gueli's body is. They said that they had held on to the body that they kidnapped on October 7th. He was killed during the October 7th attack, and then his body was kidnapped back to Gaza. They said that they had held on to his body, but that then they handed it over to Hamas operatives for safekeeping. The Hamas sources said that they knew the location of Gueli's body until several months before the ceasefire, and that he was held in the Zaytun area, that is the southern parts of Gaza City over here. However, that area has, according to the Hamas sources, been bombed out so heavily by the Israeli military that they no longer know where the body is. Whether that's true or not true, those are the updates with regards to what's happening in the search for Ron Gueli's body. I will say that many analysts, full disclosure, myself included, had not expected Hamas to know the location of most of the bodies. The fact that Hamas returned nearly all the bodies has been a surprise. To many analysts, most of us thought that Hamas either did not know the location of all the bodies or that they would hold on to these as some sort of bargaining chips. They have returned the bodies gradually over time. That said, we don't know if Hamas really does know the location of Ron Gueli's body or not. Until now, they managed to locate every other body, so it is possible that they do know, but remains to be seen. The second thing with regards to Phase 1, again, like I said, it's a Rafah crossing that I already talked about that theoretically is going to be opened in the coming days, but the exact mechanism for how Palestinians are allowed in and out, that there's been no reports on, and I would speculate has not even been negotiated yet. With that, where do things stand with regards to Phase 2? Right? I said all this stuff about Trump and Netanyahu negotiating. Okay, but in practice, what should we be looking forward to? Or what should we expect to see in the coming weeks? Phase 2, again, involves lots of different things. But in practice, what are the things that might happen? We've been looking at three different facets. One is the governing side of the Gaza Strip. Who is going to govern the Gaza Strip? And specifically, those areas that are controlled by Israel, because there's no dispute that Hamas is going to stay in charge in governing the areas that it controls. again, that is between 42 and 45%. There's no dispute that Hamas is going to do that. It's not supposed to be. That's not supposed to be what happens, what the deal originally said. But no one's talking about Hamas actually giving up its governing powers there. So factually, we're not looking at that. What we are looking at is what's going to happen in the areas that are under the Israeli control. The governing authorities are supposed to be split in two. There's supposed to be the Board of Peace. That is supposed to be this international organization that's supposed to be the overarching mechanism. Originally, it was supposed to be led by Trump. Then it was supposed to be led by Tony Blair. Then it was supposed to be led by Nikolai Mladenov. He's a Bulgarian, I believe, diplomat. It hasn't been established yet. The Board of Peace has not been established yet. Trump said it was going to happen by the end of 2025. Then he said it's going to happen in the first 2 weeks of 2026. Maybe it will. Trump has said lots of kings, lots of presidents, prime ministers, everyone wants to be part of it. We will see. We will see if that actually does get established and what does it do. The Board of Peace has been sanctioned by the UN Security Council. It's been given authority to take control over parts of Gaza and oversee the rebuilding and reconstruction. It's supposed to then somehow oversee what is happening with money coming in from the World Bank, Israel, Qatar, lots of other sources. How this actually happens, we don't know. That's one of the things that we should be looking forward to because it's going to be one of the things that really explain how the rebuilding happens. If it is in fact led by a series of international leaders, Trump, bin Salman, the Emir of Qatar, etc., if that is the case, I would argue it's going to do nothing. These leaders are in charge of their own countries. They're not going to actually be that involved in what's happening in Gaza. In turn, if it is actually staffed by lower level administration, if it is staffed by the foreign ministers, by generals, by things like that, then they may actually come to the Gaza Strip and see how it can be rebuilt to some extent. So the makeup and composition of the Board of Peace is something that we should be looking at in the coming weeks. A second thing, though, that is critically important is supposed to be a Palestinian technocratic government. The Board of Peace is supposed to be this overarching organization. It's supposed to be the coordinating mechanism to take money from the World Bank and donations that come in from Indonesia and China and then say, okay, how do we put this together to establish sewage lines in a new neighborhood that we're building in Khan Yunis? That's the Board of Peace. That has nothing to do with the actual administration on the ground. That has nothing to do with who runs the communities, who runs the municipalities, who runs the sewage lines, who is in charge of schools, who is in charge of taxes, who is in charge of police. Who administers that? According to Trump's plan, this is supposed to be a technocratic government, a committee that will be made up of 15 Palestinians that are supposed to be supposed to be unaffiliated, not belonging to Hamas, not belonging to the Palestinian Authority or the PLO, and who are supposed to just be in charge of running Gaza. What is happening with this technocratic government? Already in October, November of 2025, the different Palestinian factions got together and they submitted the lists of their candidates to the negotiating countries. It was an open secret. It was not a secret that Hamas had a lot to do with putting that list together, that Hamas had submitted at least half of the names that are not Hamas members, but are people that are affiliated with Hamas to be part of the government in Gaza. Since then, there's been no reports about a new list that was submitted. And then all of a sudden, on December 22nd, it was reported by several news outlets in Israel that Israel is now reviewing a list of Palestinians that are supposed to be that technocratic government that will assume control and responsibility over areas in the Gaza Strip, not security control, but control over the administration of the new cities that will be developed in the Gaza Strip. That's all we know at this point about the technocratic government. We don't know who actually is going to be on that list. We also don't know if Israel actually has veto power. In Trump's plan, it doesn't say that. It says that Israel will be negotiated, will be consulted alongside Egypt. It does not say it has a veto power. So at this point, we don't know. But in answer to the question that was asked above, theoretically, if these new cities are built, communities, as the United States is talking about them, are built in the areas that are administered by that are under the security control of Israel, theoretically, the governing authority there should be the technocratic government, and the overarching authority should be the Board of Peace. Security is the ISF. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the governing authority should be the technocratic government. Is that actually going to be established? Again, I do not know. I will say that there's a lot of talk about it possibly being established in the coming weeks. So that is something else to look forward to in January. However, if it is established in the coming weeks, I would venture to say it's going to do nothing. Because at this point, the Israeli military is the one that is in control of, again, 52 to 55% of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is in control of the rest of the territory. Neither one of them have any interest in giving up control for a technocratic government that has no actual legitimacy on the ground. So it may be established in name in the coming days or the coming weeks, but in fact, until there's actually some rebuilding mechanism that happens, and there are these communities that might be built in the areas that are controlled by Israel, and then there's a need for someone to govern them, the technocratic government is very unlikely to actually do anything at that point. I'm pausing here because I'm seeing a few questions, and because, as you can hear in my voice, I need to pause for water. Questions. For them to entrench themselves into daily life in Gaza, they become only possible electable leadership. Yeah, I'm sorry. I see that's a continued question, but I need that clarified because I don't remember what the initial question was. Other question from Crab Lewis. Any plausible rationale for Israel allowing its international reputation to crash as it has? Well, Crab Lewis, you assume that Israel had control over its international reputation. All countries have control over their international reputation to some extent or have influence. Israel, to put it bluntly, historically has done a very poor job when it comes to presenting itself to the world. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, some of which I'm actually going to cover in the course also, when I look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and why the world's attention shifted towards the Palestinian arena. But beyond that, when it comes to the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian side has invested far more in international diplomacy when it comes to presenting its side and its narrative. It also has backing from many more states. The Israeli side typically has not done that. Some have said because Israel actually just gave up, because they feel that the UN has a block vote against them anyway, and whether it's politics or anti-Semitism or whatever, that Israel just says it's not worth the effort. Others say, no, it's just mismanagement. There's no doubt that Israel's international reputation has suffered. Some would say rightly, some would say wrongly. Regardless of what it is, it has certainly not invested the effort to try and improve it. I'll give you that. Any other questions that are coming in? I'm seeing a couple of comments, but I'm giving another second to questions before I go on to some of the other things that are associated again with phase 2, what we should be looking at, before I move on to what like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hamas. Giving another 10 seconds. Taking this opportunity again, just as I see people coming and going, I'm again copying into the chat 2 links, one to my newsletter, the other to an online course I'm now developing. Feel free to check both of those out. There's a lot to learn and discuss. Comment coming from Israel. As an Israeli, many of us don't care what the world says. We need to protect ourselves. That is a that's a very common perception within Israel. I will say that while Israel says it doesn't care what the world says, if at any point there's a situation where there's enough forces in the world that the United States stops vetoing the UN Security Council, then all of a sudden Israel's going to care very much about what the world says. It's one of the things that Israelis tend to ignore. I'm also born and raised in Israel, very familiar with that sentiment. At the same time, I'm not sure that it will hold water long term. And Grabulos, in response to the question about why Israel let it go, I believe it. It's a very serious question. I just think the reasons for it are multifaceted, and a lot of it has to do simply with mismanagement. A lot of it has to do simply with not actually taking responsibility and investing in international diplomacy as much as the country possibly should. But if it seems like I wasn't taking it seriously, forgive me. It's just one of the questions that I'm like, yes, they should. They just don't invest as much in their international reputation. So, I see there's another question. I will get into that. The question about, let me rephrase, sorry. What is Hamas doing in terms of civics, healthcare, education? Excellent question. And I'm going to get to that once I'm done with phase 2. You're asking all the right questions today that are really leading me down the path of what I plan to talk about. So, other things that are related to phase 2. Sorry, all of a sudden, my cold is coming back. Other things that are related to phase 2 that we should be looking to in the coming month. And again, this is just because it's the beginning of 2026 and everything was supposed to happen in 2026. The ISF, the International Stabilization Force, that is another facet that is a big question. What is going to happen in the areas that are controlled by Israel that these new cities are supposed to be established? The ISF was supposed to be made up of lots of different militaries coming from Arab states, European states, Asian states, etc. The United States has been very disappointed that actually no one wants to be part of it. No one wants to be part of it because its mission parameters are very unclear. It's unclear if it's supposed to engage Hamas militarily and disarm it, or if it's supposed to then protect civilians and then will have to protect them from Israel. Is it supposed to engage Israel and Hamas or act as a police force? Is it going to be like international peacekeepers? No one actually knows what the ISF is supposed to do. As a result, at this point, there is no clarity over any country that might be joining. A lot of countries have said they might join. Indonesia has said that they'd be willing to send medical units. And Greece has said that they were willing to send engineering units to help the rebuilding of Gaza. Italy has said that they're willing to send troops to train Palestinian police. No one wants to commit actual forces except for Turkey. Turkey is the only country that is constantly saying we're ready, willing, and able to send our military into the Gaza Strip to carry out the missions of the ISF. This is terrifying Israel, and also Turkey is coordinating its efforts right now with Hamas to some extent. So at this point, there's a bit of a stalemate. One of the surprising things that happened over the last week, the Deputy Prime Minister of Pakistan said that Pakistan was willing to send troops to the ISF, but then very quickly clarified and said, yes, but only if they're not supposed to disarm Hamas. So at that point, we are still completely stuck. And that is really where we're stuck with regards to phase 2. We have the governing side, we have the ISF. All these things theoretically are supposed to happen in January of 2026. And that's why I'm spending a lot of time on them, even though, as you've noticed, I'm saying mostly we don't know anything about them. But it is likely that Trump is going to announce their establishment, announce that they're moving forward, and then we're going to have to contend with, okay, so what does that actually mean? Where do we stand when it comes to how these things are going to be implemented in the Gaza Strip? Last thing I'll say about phase 2, there is Hamas. Hamas refuses to disarm publicly. It has said it's not going to disarm. There were also reports that after the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, Hamas felt empowered. They actually felt like they were going to see compromises from Israel. They're very encouraged by the fact that Trump compelled Israel to open the Rafah crossing, and Hamas therefore wants to move on to phase 2 because, again, this is now a quote from I think it was Al Jazeera that was quoting Hamas sources that said Hamas believes they can weather the storm when it comes to disarming and not actually go through with it, and that's why it wants to proceed on to phase 2. Next thing I'm going to talk about is Hamas, the Hamas leadership, and what it's doing in the Gaza Strip. But I'm pausing here one more time to take a look at some of the questions. Thank you, everyone, for all the participation today. It's a lot of fun when I see people are listening. Okay. So the question, what is Hamas doing in the Gaza Strip? That Yael asked. Again, I'm going to talk about it now. So if I don't actually answer your question, let me know. The biggest Scrabble says the biggest mistake a Jew can make, much less Israel, is to lose track of the odds and not prepare for them. Once again, I don't disagree that Israel is not necessarily acting the most intelligent and looking towards a future banner by not actually taking seriously its international reputation. I'm just saying it's a fact that they tend to not. Question: does it not have to do with the disenfranchisement of labor at so-called secular left? It's an interesting point when it comes to the question. Again, I'm going to rephrase it. Tell me if I understood correctly. Is the fact that the hawkish right-wing government in Israel is much more, I'll say, nationalistic and sort of focused inward, does that not have to do with Israel losing control of its international reputation? I'll say, though, if we look at history, if we look at the first Intifada, the second Intifada, when there was still a much stronger presence of the left, the same thing happened. Israel does not tend to invest that much in trying to maintain its international reputation. The Palestinian sources, the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian organizations throughout history have invested millions in setting up news agencies and in also talking even to the sides that they think completely hate them. Palestinian sources, there are dedicated reporters. Their job is to talk to Israeli news outlets to explain what the Palestinians are thinking and present things on the Palestinian side. Israel simply does not do that. So even long before it was not as much of a hawkish right-wing government, Israel has never invested as much historically in trying to maintain its international reputation. Other question: do you think Trump has a plan for disarming Hamas? I believe he does. It may be. So far, I haven't seen anything to lead me to actually think that there is a plan to do that. Even Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have stopped talking about disarming Hamas. They have said that they hope Hamas will disarm in the future, i.e. that they hope that Hamas will choose to disarm. The United States is clearly not planning on sending troops into the Gaza Strip. They're also not allowing Israel to continue the war. Not that Israel was succeeding in disarming Hamas itself, but they're not allowing Israel to send troops in. So I have to say, at this point, I don't see a plan. The United States has to disarm Hamas, but there may be. I do not claim to know the inner workings of Trump or Netanyahu or any other leader's mind. Question: is it possible that Turkey is using this to dicker over the state at Israel base, the state of Israel base? Clarify the question for me, Crabwoos, if you will, because I think I understand, but I'm not sure. Because I'm running out of time, I don't want to take it in the wrong direction. So clarify that question, and I will try to answer it at the end. So, next thing I want to talk about, next big thing is Hamas. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on what Hamas is doing in the Gaza Strip, and also the elections that are upcoming for Hamas's leadership. Firstly, in the Gaza Strip, while the Israeli side of the Israeli areas that are controlled, the areas of Gaza that are controlled by Israel, in those areas, like I said, in Rafah, there's been a lot of flattening operations. The city has been razed to the ground and clearing some of the rubble. In the areas that are controlled by Hamas, where the vast majority of Palestinians live, in the Gaza Strip, I would say about 85% to 90% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip live in the areas that are controlled by Hamas. Over the last 2 weeks, there were a lot of reports that Hamas is actually in a vast boom of reestablishing its governing control. Some examples of reports from the last week, and these come, again, from journalists and bloggers on the ground in Gaza. Hamas has set up new checkpoints throughout northern areas of Gaza and southern areas of Gaza in order to increase security, both in terms of trying to increase its governing powers, but also because there's been a lot of theft and crime, because most of the people are living in tents, everyone's internally displaced. As a result, they're carrying out more security operations. The municipalities in the areas of Deir el-Balah, El-Bureij, Gaza City, areas of Al-Muwasi, and areas of a Nuseirat refugee camp, all of those municipalities are now reporting full capacity. They are up and running all of their departments. If you think about it, the Department of Municipality means anything from restoring sewage lines to administration of taxes to civil works and trying to rebuild the areas in the Gaza Strip. That doesn't mean they're successful, but they are up and running. And that unto itself is an indication that Hamas is far from giving up its governing powers and instead is actually developing its governing powers in the Gaza Strip. Other examples: Hamas has started to impose increased taxes on the different merchants in the Gaza Strip. Lots of aid is coming into the Gaza Strip. The United States took over the aid coming into Gaza, and right now there are between 600 to 800 aid trucks coming in per day. These aid trucks end up in the areas of the Gaza Strip that are controlled by Hamas. Hamas now runs the municipalities. That means that Hamas does not need to take over the aid physically anymore. Like it took over some of the aid during the active fighting in the war. At this point, the aid gets to local merchants. Hamas has begun to impose increased taxes on them. So without taking over the aid, Hamas is now again getting rich as a result of the aid coming in to the Gaza Strip just by imposing taxes on the merchants. Other things that has happened, Hamas has taken over the distribution of the permanent tent structures. So as part of preparing for winter, there was an upswing in the amount of more reinforced tents that were brought into the Gaza Strip. Hamas took over all those shipments and then started distributing them through their own mechanisms, which again involves taxes and is another indication of governing capabilities. And the last thing, and this is by and large, from a humanitarian perspective, obviously a good thing, but it also shows the increased governing powers of Hamas, schools. The school system in the areas that are controlled by Hamas are by and large up and running. They're all in makeshift tents. They're not by any means any established school system, but Hamas has also reopened the main university campus in Gaza City. All of these things are happening while Hamas is theoretically supposed to lose its governing power and disarm and essentially cease to be the main force in the Gaza Strip. So it's something to pay attention to. That while there's this vision in Trump's plan that Hamas is going to disappear, factually, that's not the trajectory that is happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip. But the next thing that I want to talk about, and this is the big thing, and it relates to the leadership election that is going to happen in Hamas. And for this, I need to explain, and I'm going to do it very briefly here, because like I said, I'm going to upload a summary to my channel where I'm going to talk about the Hamas leadership more broadly, its history. So if you're not subscribed, good opportunity. Subscribe and hit that notification so you'll see when that comes out. Hopefully it'll come out in the coming days. When I say that there's going to be elections to Hamas's leadership, that does not mean elections to the leader in Gaza. Hamas's leadership structure is made up of several different organizations, and the most important one is known as the Political Bureau. The Political Bureau historically has always been outside of the Palestinian territories. It's been outside of the Gaza Strip, outside of the West Bank. It used to be in Syria, then it was in Jordan briefly, then it was again in Syria, in Lebanon, and eventually ended up in Qatar. The leader of the Political Bureau, ever since the assassination of Ahmed Yassin during the Second Intifada, the leader of the Political Bureau is the official leader of Hamas, even though that leader does not reside in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. They're the official leader of the Hamas movement. Underneath that leader, there are representatives of different entities. There's a representative that is the leader of Hamas in Gaza. And then there's a representative that is the leader of Hamas in the West Bank. Then there's a representative that's a leader of Hamas in the Israeli prisons. And there's a representative that's a leader of Hamas representing the diaspora. The leader of the Political Bureau has historically been a very, very important figure because even though Hamas in the Gaza Strip is the one that actually on the ground fights Israel and governs Gaza, the negotiations that happen, the overarching trajectory of where Hamas is going is all decided upon by the leader of the Political Bureau. Just as an example, what happened in 2017 is that Ismail Haniyeh was elected to become the leader of the Political Bureau, and that is when Hamas reconciled with Iran. Hamas had a feud with Iran as a result of the Syrian civil war, and Iran actually cut off all its funding. And Ismail Haniyeh becomes a leader. Ismail Haniyeh liked Iran and had good relations with Iran. And so he rebuilds that relationship, and then Iran becomes much more involved in what's happening with Hamas. Ismail Haniyeh was the leader of the Political Bureau, and Yahya Sinwar was the leader of Hamas in Gaza, the representative in Gaza. Then the war breaks out. Ismail Haniyeh is technically in charge of Hamas, but Yahya Sinwar is actually the one calling the shots. Ismail Haniyeh is assassinated in July of 2024, and then Yahya Sinwar becomes the leader of the Political Bureau. He is killed in October. Since then, the Hamas leadership is split among a committee of 5 people. That's not how Hamas is supposed to operate. It has a constitution, and now they're going to have elections for the role of the overarching leader. There are 2 prime candidates that are most likely to win. One of them is Halil al-Haya. The other is Khalid Mashal. Halil al-Haya is currently the representative of the Gaza Strip, and he is the person that's the figurehead when it comes to the Hamas's negotiations right now. Khalid Mashal is historically, he was the leader of the political bureau for many, many years, throughout most of the 21st century, and he's always resided in Qatar. Right now, they're all in Qatar. Why do I say this is critically important? Halil al-Haya is far more militant than Khalid Mashal. Halil al-Haya was not in favor of Trump's deal originally. He wanted Hamas to keep fighting. He is the one that is constantly pushing and constantly saying that Hamas is happy to return to fighting at any time. If he becomes the leader of Hamas, we are very likely going to see a continuous merging of Hamas with Iran and a far more militant stance when it comes to the possibilities of Hamas. Does it want to become more of a political party? Does it want to just maintain control of the Gaza Strip? Or does it want to return to fighting? Khalil al-Haya, even though himself a politician, he did not grow up in the Al-Qassam brigades. He would favor a more militant stance. Khalid Mashal, in turn, is no lover of Israel. He's by far not a dove. But within the political structures of Hamas, Khalid Mashal is more pragmatic. Khalid Mashal grew up much more associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. That puts him on the side more of Qatar, on the side more of Saudi Arabia, and he himself does not like Iran. He is actually the one that orchestrated the big feud with Iran back in 2011. He has been advocating that Hamas lost the military battle, and even though Hamas still should aspire for the destruction of Israel, it might need to do that in other means. It might need to do that from a political side. It might need to bide its time. It might need to go more pragmatic in order to try to then rebuild itself in a different way. If he's elected leader, we will see a very different approach of Hamas. Once again, I'm not suggesting that if Khalid Mashal is elected leader, there will be peace in the Middle East and Hamas is going to become a lover of Israel. But the day-to-day negotiations over phase 2, the trajectory of how the next year looks, how 2026 looks, is largely going to be governed, I would argue, by the identity of this new leader in Hamas that's going to be elected in the coming weeks. There is, at the same time, there are some rumors that Hamas is very scared of a collision between these two leaders and might try to choose a compromise candidate. That compromise candidate would probably be Muhammad Darwish. He is the leader of the Shura Council. He's a religious figure. And he navigates between these two positions. Once again, like I said, I'm going to upload another video that specifically talks about what is happening in the Hamas leadership, how do we understand it, and why it's so important. Here, all I am saying is when it comes to January 2026, and if we're looking at phase 2, we're looking at what the United States is doing, what Israel is doing, Trump and Netanyahu, something that I would argue has been vastly overlooked is what does Hamas want? Because while Hamas at this point, when it came to the balance of power between Israel and the United States and Hamas might have been seen as the weaker party, the fact is they're still in control of Gaza, or at least of the part of Gaza where Palestinians live. The fact is that according to Israeli intelligence, Hamas still has over 60,000 guns, thousands of rockets, and tens of thousands of armed operatives. In answer to the question I was asked before, where do they get their guns? Is it all from caches? Some of it is from smuggling. Some of it is weapon storages that they had. But something that is vastly overlooked is that the vast majority of Hamas's missiles and guns and rockets are self-produced. They are manufactured in the Gaza Strip. Hamas has the know-how, they have the technical capabilities, and when you are the government and you invest a lot of your money in this, you also have the money and the time. And so Hamas is busy rebuilding, And who is elected the next leader of Hamas, I would argue, is actually going to be one of the most deciding factors when it comes to what is the future of the phase 2 and how Hamas is going to look, and therefore how Gaza is going to look to some extent. I'm pausing here to look if there are any more questions. Once again, I'm going to say, if you've just joined now, I am putting in 2 links in the chat. One of them is to my newsletter. The other is to a course that I'm developing that is going to be taught in February, 4 sessions, that is going to look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The aim is to help people understand how we got to where we are and how we got to October 7th, and possibly to try to understand the future of the Gaza Strip. When people say, well, this should happen, that should happen, let's look at the past and see what has been tried and where we are. So that's the aim. I'm putting in those 2 links in the chat now. Feel free. Happy to see anyone there. With that, I'm pausing to see if there are any more questions. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. If I did not answer the questions I said I was going to answer about Hamas, then please repeat them. Let's see. Israeli Command College should all go study in Al-Azhar for a few years. You're not the first one to make that point, Crabulous. One of the anecdotes I've heard also about Hamas's tunnels is that a lot of engineering schools need to take their lessons from the Islamic University in Gaza. Okay. With that, I was going to say another couple of words about the West Bank and about Lebanon, but I see I'm over an hour now. So mostly what I'm going to say is, like I said about the West Bank, it is still the same dynamic of increased settlement activity and violent spirals between both sides. Hezbollah and Lebanon, the only thing I'm going to say very briefly is right now, technically, we are in limbo because the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon stated that Hezbollah would be disarmed by a certain date, and then they determined that that certain date was December 31st of 2025. That didn't happen. The Lebanese military is constantly saying it's about to happen, it's almost done, it's going to be there. According to some reports, they're going to announce next week that it's done. Israel is saying it's vastly not done and that Hezbollah still has a presence in southern Lebanon. So right now, we're in a deep state of limbo when it comes to what's happening in Lebanon. It would not be surprising if that arena flares up again, because it's a little bit like when the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas expired in March of 2025 and just stayed that way for 2 weeks, and no one knew what was going to happen until it exploded. Likely, that may happen again, this time between Israel and Hezbollah. Otherwise, if there are no other questions, I'm going to thank everyone for joining. Like I said, my name is Alon Burstein. I am a professor of political science and Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. This is the Israel-Palestine Report. If you have not subscribed yet, please do subscribe. Hit that like button. Send this on to anyone who you think might be interested. And do check out the newsletter and especially the new courses that I am offering. Again, it's all in the interest of trying to increase everyone's knowledge and understanding about this very interesting but very complicated region. Have a wonderful 2026, and thank you all for joining.